Hey everybody, it's Matt, and welcome to Week 9. We are going to be talking about patrol operations this week. Looking forward to jumping into this. Well, this week we get to talk about patrol operations, and next week about investigations. Two of the foundations of the fundamental things about policing. So let's begin by just kind of jumping in and talking about the patrol division and what that is. Now, I refer to this as the foundation of the police department, and I want to explain to you what I'm talking about there. And I've put up there, think about the watch and ward. So if you think back to how policing first started in the history of Western civilization, remember, we did not have a formalized police department until the Metropolitan Policing Act of 1829. So before that, we had the watch and ward and different kind of variances of that in agrarian communities. And that was based on what? If you think back to who the watchman might be for that night, that person had to stay up all night, walk around the village, check the lanterns, check the weather, make sure no intruders were getting in, make sure nothing was on fire, and really just provide for the security of the entire village. That was your first basic, most rudimentary form of a patrol officer. They were out there on foot. So when I say it's the foundation of the police department, think of the very first thing that we ever came up with to combat crime, and that is somebody out on foot, walking around, making sure everything is okay. Now, another way to look at this is to think of what would happen if we had to peel back the police department to its basic foundation. What would we give up until we had only one assignment left? So, for example, if you look at Boise Police Department, they've got a crime prevention division, they've got a community outreach division, they've got an investigations division, they've got a patrol division. Well, when we went through an economic crisis in 2008, 2009, 2010, back in those days, when they cut positions, it was always to keep staffing on patrol at the correct level. So they were cutting from the community outreach division, from all the small specialties to support specific other missions, always to make sure that we keep patrol officers on the street. Now, you might be saying, well, we need investigations, and yes, I agree with you. But investigations do not trump patrol. In the very smallest departments throughout the United States, there are no detectives. Patrol officers do all their own follow-up investigations. Actually, it's a very good idea to start your career in an agency like this because you learn to investigate and write reports very, very well because it ends with you. There is nobody after you. But with that said, even though investigations is a very important function, they come second to patrol. Patrol is the foundation of a police department. Police officers and patrol officers in specific are gatekeepers of the criminal justice system. They basically decide who comes in and who does not come in to the criminal justice system. So if you think about it, think about somebody with just a minor crime, like somebody who's in possession of less than an ounce of marijuana. They get stopped by a police officer one night. That police officer can arrest them, take them to jail. This is in Idaho. Or they can write them a ticket, or they can issue them a warning. The police officer has the discretion to do either of those three things. Under certain circumstances, they're going to introduce somebody into the criminal justice system, maybe through an arrest, maybe through a citation. And then under other circumstances, they're not going to introduce that person to the criminal justice system. They're going to give them a warning and let them go on their way. This makes police officers, and specifically patrol, the gatekeepers of the criminal justice system. Okay, so let's look at some patrol activities. What do patrol officers do? Well, enforcing the law, that's the one that, we all think of. That's the one we see on TV. Deterring crime, being out there and just being visible and being present. Think of this for a second. You may have not thought of this before, but compare and contrast patrol officers with firefighters. Firefighters stay in their stations ready to respond and react if an incident happens. Patrol officers get done with their briefing, they go out onto the street, and if there are no calls for service, they drive around. They drive around looking for and trying to detect crime, but they're also out there being very visible in an attempt to deter criminal activity. They also maintain order, and that is really a primary function of a patrol officer. And they do this again by being present, by being out on the street. Think of going downtown into downtown Boise on a Friday or Saturday night, especially if you're down there late. And if there were no police officers anywhere, would people who've been consuming alcohol be more prone to do something stupid? Versus when you've got teams of officers walking down the street and just being present. They don't even have to take enforcement action. They just maintain order through their deterrent capabilities. Keeping the peace, and when we talk about this, we talk about breaking up fights and things like that, yes, for sure. But really, a lot of times, when two people are having a dispute they can't resolve, they will call the police, and the police can show up and they can mediate that dispute. Enforcing traffic laws, so keeping traffic flowing, is an order maintenance issue. Investigating traffic accidents, order maintenance issue. Stopping people for traffic violations that are endangering the public safety issue. Assisting vulnerable populations. We spend a lot of time in that as patrol officers, doing welfare checks on people, whether that's for mental health, for drug issues, maybe people who are elderly, things like that. Keeping traffic flowing, we talked about that, investigating accidents, and conducting preliminary investigations. Investigations begin with patrol officers, and then they decide whether or not they think the investigation should go to a detective, and if they believe that's the case, they will route that report to a detective, and then their sergeant will look at that and decide whether or not their routing decision is appropriate. And then, of course, responding to calls. Okay, so what are the goals of a patrol officer? Well, law enforcement and public service, of course, deterrence of crime, perception of public safety. We want to reduce fear of crime. Now, you're going to be reading the article Broken Windows coming up here in a few weeks. It deals a lot with the issue of fear of crime. Let me give you a very basic explanation of this right now. When the public fears that they will be the victim of crime, they tend to not go out and do what we call pro-social activities. They tend to stay in their homes, in their apartments, or stay at least in their homes or their apartments in the evenings. This creates an atmosphere of, or what we call a crime-conducive atmosphere, an atmosphere where it's more likely that people will be able to commit crime because there's less good people out on the streets. But when fear of crime is reduced, people go out and they enjoy their communities after dark, during the daytime. They go for walks, they go for bike rides, they engage in commerce, and this creates a situation in which it is not a crime-conducive environment. If you live in or around or enjoy the area of Meridian, Idaho, Boise, Idaho, Eagle, Idaho, and even Nampa and Caldwell, despite what certain reputations may hold, you are witnessing communities with a lot of pro-social activities, communities where people feel a very reduced level of fear of crime, and thus are out and about enjoying those services both day and night. They are not crime-conducive communities. Another goal of law enforcement, 24-hour availability. Now, believe it or not, this does not exist everywhere in the United States. As a matter of fact, the Idaho State Police Department has only had 24-hour availability here in the Treasure Valley for about 6 or 7 years now. Prior to that, they actually did not have 24-hour availability, and not every town throughout the United States or every county throughout the United States does have 24-hour availability. We'll talk about random patrol really quick. So when a police officer leaves the building when they're done with briefing and they head out to go onto the street, where do they go? Does somebody tell them where to go? Well, in general, no. Nobody does, except for maybe they're expected, but not instructed, but expected to be in their patrol area. But really, we let patrol officers decide where they're going to go, and we call this random patrol. Now, we still do this. By and large, this is what patrol officers do when they leave their police departments after briefing and go out for their shift, is they go out and at random, they patrol around their assigned patrol areas. But is this necessarily the most efficient use of police? Well, we actually did an experiment about this all the way back in the early 1970s called the Kansas City Preventative Patrol Experiment, and we wanted to know, Does random patrol have any impact on crime rates as well as fear of crime? The results were no effect on crime rates, no effects on attitudes towards police, no effect on fear, as well as rates of reported crime, and citizens did not even know that an experiment was taking place. And this really opened the door for agencies to experiment with different patrol strategies. So what did we do during this experiment? Well, what they did is they separated the city into 4 basic areas, and then they changed patrol strategies in each of those areas. One area remained random. One area was directed, meaning they told officers where to go. Another area, they were concentrated highly in just one neighborhood. And then in another area, they did no patrolling at all. They still responded to calls, but they did no patrolling at all. And when they compared the results of surveys from each of these places, including the area where there was no patrol officers, they saw no difference in fear of crime or crime rates. Isn't that interesting? So this gave police departments permission to take their patrol officers and do things like directed patrol, which means taking them and concentrating them in one area that's high crime and neglecting patrol in other areas that are not. The fear used to be, well, if you take these officers and you shift them to the high crime areas, then the other areas are going to become high crime because there's no officers driving around. But we found that that is not true, so we do have the ability to do that. But even with that knowledge, by and large today, we still are mostly a random patrol type of service. Okay, response times. How long does it take for a police officer to get to a call? Now, there's some assumptions about response times. One is that quicker responses will result in greater satisfaction of citizens, which, after all, those are our customers. We want to make sure they're satisfied, and an increased likelihood that a suspect will be apprehended. There's a problem with this. Now, based on this assumption, by the way, we've spent a lot of money on CAD, which is computer-aided dispatch, faster vehicles, beat models, so we're more strategic in where we're patrolling. But there's a problem with this idea that there's an increased likelihood that a suspect will be apprehended. I'm going to give you a second to think about that. What do you think that problem might be? What variable might be in here where it really doesn't matter how fast an officer responds to a call? All right, so you've had a moment to think about that. Let me tell you what I'm going for. If you think about all the variables that factor into the response time of a police officer, the very first variable that we encounter is when somebody sees a crime taking place, how long does it take them to call dispatch? Now, you might think they call immediately, but not necessarily so. If it's something blatant, like you're driving by a gas station and you see a guy with a ski mask on inside pointing a gun at the clerk, you probably dial 911 right away. But if you're listening to a fight, or if you see somebody acting suspiciously, or maybe you've seen somebody spray paint the side of a fence or something like that, a lot of people spend a lot of time debating whether or not to call the police for any number of reasons. This has to be factored into response times because that gives the suspect more time to escape. And the more time the suspect has to escape, the more likely that the response time that we have is just not going to matter. So we have to factor that in. The other thing we have to factor in is when the call gets called in. Did we discover it the next morning, or did we actually see it happening while it was in progress? So some response time variables: time between the crime occurring and the police being called, time required for dispatchers to process the call. So that when the call finally does come in, how long does it take for the dispatcher to get the information, or actually the call taker to get the information, get it over to the dispatcher, and then get the information out to the police officer? The travel time from dispatching to arrival, and what is our response level? Is it code 1, code 2, or code 3? Code 1 meaning get there whenever you can, but no rush. You don't have to go directly there. Code 2 is go directly there, but no lights and siren. And code 3 is an emergency. We must go with lights and siren because we need to get there as quickly as possible. Now, response times have really kind of been debunked as a big deal, although they still matter in some cases. But I wanted to put this article up there for you. This goes back to 2008, but still just 11 years ago now, the Albuquerque Police Department, in their negotiations on contracts and funding for policing, we're still talking about response time. So you can see how this factors in. If you want to read through that, what's on the side there, go ahead and pause that and take a look. Here, just pause the video. All right, so focusing on response times. What we found with that Kansas City experiment is that response times didn't make as big of a difference, but a lot of times we had so many calls coming in, we could not respond to all of them equally, so we had to come up with a priority system for calls, and we would try and give callers an approximate time when an officer would arrive. Sometimes it doesn't matter when it comes to the victims. Now, I'll come back to that in a second. So let's talk about this priority system for calls. So I will use Ada County as an example. We have a priority 1, priority 2, and a priority 3 call. Priority 1, while it sounds like it's the highest priority, it's actually not. We make it correspond with our codes, our response codes. So our priority 1 is our lowest level call. Like somebody woke up in the morning, found that their car had been vandalized. We're going to get to that whenever we can, but it's not an emergency. Priority 2, that's something that we feel like we need to go directly to, but not in an emergency fashion. And then priority 3, that is an emergency. That's like somebody is being shot at right now. We need to get there as quickly as possible. So when it comes to victims, sometimes that doesn't matter because sometimes we've got victims who are injured, things like that, and we need to go right now. The priority system doesn't matter, and that's generally a priority 3 or a code 3 call. Now, what we found is that we give these approximations to people of when we're going to arrive. We're always worried about the satisfaction of the citizens that we're serving, and what we found is even if it takes us a long time to respond, as long as we are giving a phone call to the person and saying, hey, I'm sorry, we're busy, we're going to emergency calls, and we've got you on our mind, but we're just having a hard time getting there right now, that increases citizen satisfaction. So that's something I used to do as a sergeant. When we were very busy, I would look at all the calls that were holding on the screen, the ones that had been holding for a long time. I would just call those people up, say, hey, this is Sergeant Breckwald. I apologize, but we're very busy. We're trying to get to you as soon as we can, and it's probably going to be a couple hours. I'm sorry about that. That tended to make people happy with this. They would understand that we're busy with emergency calls. Now, when we look at directed patrol, again, this is a specific direction on where to patrol during your free time away from calls. We have split force patrols. Part of the unit will go out and handle calls. The other part is not responsible for calls. They go out and do proactive police work, not responsive police work. And differential response to calls. Non-emergency calls have many ways to be handled without sending an officer. We can have civilians handle those calls and take those reports. We can have people do internet reports and file their own. And they can even call in and we can take reports over the telephone to get those things done. So how do we manage the demand? Because there's a large demand for the time of police officers, but a low supply of police officers, at least during peak times when we're very, very busy. And there's an assumption that goes with this, and that is that police can do very little other than responding to calls because we go from call to call to call to call to call to call. All right, you get my humor there. So there's an assumption, but when we really look at it, we find out that there's actually quite a bit of free time built into a police officer's day, and thus there is some time for proactive policing and problem solving and things like that. We'll touch back on that when we get to our chapter on community policing. So here are some innovative ways of managing the demand for police officer time. One is call prioritization. 2, handling some calls by people who are not sworn officers, so community service officers, people walking in and filing reports in person with a civilian, internet crime reporting, phone reports, mailing things in, sending emails, all sorts of different possible ways. And when we look at some of the research that's been done over the years in terms of the management of demand for police officers' time, we have definitely been able to show there is available time in the shift for a police officer to engage in proactive policing into crime prevention efforts and things like that. That has a lot of implications for COP, which is actually an acronym for community-oriented policing. Time actually can be reserved for problem-solving activities, and we'll get to that in our community policing chapter. All right, let's talk about some tactical operations of patrol. There is aggressive patrol, where you're removed from that call rotation. Dispatchers do not send you calls, so you can go out and you can be proactive. You can find crime. Saturation patrol, going into an area with a large amount of officers and stopping people, talking to people, really creating a presence. Decoy vehicles, putting the impression of police presence out there. We call this a force multiplier. Let me give you an example. When I was sergeant at the Boise Airport, we had patrol vehicles out there, but our officers spent a vast majority of their time on foot inside the airport. So we didn't park all of the police vehicles in a separate police parking lot. We parked them in strategic locations around the airport, and that helped to give the appearance that there were more police officers present there than there actually were. And then alternative vehicle deployment. We do this in Boise quite a bit as well. We have a bicycle officer team, and they can patrol areas that cars cannot, namely the Greenbelt. They can get through downtown very well, back alleyways, and areas like that. Special operations. In patrol, we have SWAT. Stands for Special Weapons and Tactics. Some agencies call it SOU, or Special Operations Unit. New York PD calls it the Emergency Services Unit because they do a little bit more than just special weapons and tactics. I've got that right there. Canines. Canines for drug detection, patrol, explosive, search and rescue, cadaver detection, all sorts of incredible things that canines can do. All right, now I want to talk about another tactical part of patrol, and that is the police pursuit. There are two types we're going to talk about: a foot pursuit as well as a vehicular pursuit, and whether or not we should do both or under what circumstances we should. Let's talk about foot pursuits really quick and officer mortality. Now, foot pursuits are dangerous, but every officer likes to engage in foot pursuits. And I have a video up. You've probably actually already watched it, where we talked a little bit more about that. And we've got a video up this week that you'll find in our video digest of a foot pursuit. And we kind of break that down, or I break that down in that supplemental video or that follow-up video about this week. You can see just how dangerous that was. And as you're watching that, you can see if that camera crew wasn't there, there probably would have been a different outcome of this foot pursuit. Check out that follow-up video for more on that and on officer mortality. Vehicular pursuits, we've got a video of that up to date this week as well. And they are dangerous. They are very dangerous to the public. And most actually end up being conducted for minor traffic violations. Now, the rationale always goes like this, is that if I pull somebody over for running a stop sign or for speeding, and they take off and they flee and we have a pursuit, they've probably got a dead body in the trunk, or they've probably committed a really, really bad crime. Otherwise, why would they flee? That's been the rationale for years. But we finally studied it, and we found out that sometimes people just flee. There's nothing else going on. So it's a really hotly debated topic. A lot of departments have really strict policies when it comes to police pursuits. And always we're dealing with the question of should we or should we not pursue offenders in vehicles. Now, I will tell you, let me give you an example. Police pursuits very often wind up with an innocent party who's not involved at all being harmed or killed. This just happened this last winter down in Modesto, California. That's where I'm from, so I still read the newspaper from down there. And there was two guys that were wanted for a homicide. They'd been located. They ran from the police in their vehicle. A large vehicular pursuit ensued. Now, this is very commonplace when you have a crime this serious, a homicide. And we have to weigh the public interest. What is our interest in catching this person versus the danger we're putting the public in by engaging in the vehicular pursuit? We always got to weigh those two things. Under the circumstances where we're chasing murder suspects, we probably believe we better get these people caught so it justifies the risk to the public. But this pursuit actually ended with the two murder suspects crashing into a seating area at a group of taco trucks in downtown Modesto and killing two individuals who were sitting there eating that evening. That happens a lot with vehicular pursuits, at least enough that we have to take a really close look at why we engage in those pursuits. All right, well, that is all I've got for you on patrol procedure. I hope you enjoy the traffic. Sorry about skipping forward there for you. Hope you enjoy the chapter. Sorry, did I say traffic? Hope you enjoy the chapter, everybody. And let me know if you have any questions. I'd be happy to answer those for you. Have a great week.